Left with no time to scream before the current closed over her head, Eliza Marsh understood, in the strange calm that comes just before drowning, that the men who had dragged her from her own doorstep to the river crossing had never once intended for her to climb back out of it. She had nursed half of Concord Crossing through the fever that autumn, had sat up nights with the Bragg boy and the Otley twins and old Reverend Price's ailing wife, had done everything her mother had taught her of tinctures and cool cloths, and the slow, patient work of keeping a body breathing until its own strength returned. Some had lived. 3 had not, among them the Bragg boy, and grief in a frightened town did not look for reasons so much as it looked for someone to blame. And Nathaniel Bragg, who fancied himself the moral authority of Concord Crossing, since there was no real magistrate within 40 miles to contradict him, had decided within a week of burying his son that the outsider healer who'd failed to save him must have poisoned the well rather than simply failed against an illness no doctor in the territory could have beaten. He had said the word which first in a whisper, and by the time the whisper had traveled the length of the town, it had grown teeth. They had come for her at dawn, a dozen men with faces she had tended fever sweat from not a month before, and dragged her the half-mile to the crossing on the theory, older than any of them, that the river would judge her guilt, where the law could not, that a guilty woman would float, cursed and buoyant, and an innocent one would simply sink and drown, proving her innocence to God alone. In the last moment it could do her any good at all. She had come to Concord Crossing 3 years before, a widow of 26 with no family left in the East worth writing to, and had built what small standing she had in that town, one tended fever at a time, one birth eased through the night, one broken arm splinted true, because a healer's hands, she had believed, spoke a language every town understood regardless of how new a face might be. She had believed, too, that gratitude built slowly was gratitude that lasted, and had never once imagined that the same hands trusted to ease a child's suffering could, within the space of a single terrified week, be recast as the hands that had caused it. She thought of that now, going under, of every night she had sat up with Nathaniel Bragg's own fevered son telling him stories to keep his mind off the pain, and found the injustice of it almost harder to bear than the cold closing over her head. She had not floated. She went under hard, the current far stronger than the shallow crossing led on, and the cold took her breath before she could waste it screaming, and she was being carried downstream past the rocks and the willow roots with her lungs already burning when something closed around her arm with a grip like iron, and hauled her up into air and daylight she had not expected to see again. She came to on the riverbank coughing river water and bile, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe that smelled of wood smoke and rain, with a man's face swimming into focus above her. Not one of Concord Crossing's men, not anyone she had ever seen, dark-eyed and weathered, and entirely calm in a way that seemed, to her fever-rattled senses, almost impossible given what he must have just done. 2 younger men stood just behind him, dripping as he was, one still holding the length of rawhide rope they had thrown toward him in the water though it had gone unused in the end, his own strength and the current together having been enough. He said something to her low, and even in a language she did not know. And then, when her eyes found his and held there in evident confusion, he tried again in halting but serviceable English. "You are safe," he said. "You are on my land now. No one here will finish what they started." She should have been afraid of him. Every story she had ever been told in Concord Crossing about the people who lived along that river had been built for fear. Warnings passed down at supper tables by men who had never once tried to learn a name. And instead she found herself weeping, helpless, undignified weeping, because the last hand that had touched her before this one had been shoving her toward the water rather than pulling her from it, and something in her simply broke open at the difference. Tatanka Ska had been riding the river bend with two of his young men that morning, checking a fish where his people had tended for 3 generations, when he saw the shape of a woman break the surface downstream, arms no longer fighting the current, and had gone in without pausing to consider whether she was worth the risk. Because a man who paused to weigh such things before acting was not a man he cared to become. He had lost enough already to a river's cold indifference. His wife, 5 winters gone now, taken by a fever no different in its cruelty than the one that had apparently just cost this stranger everything. To ever again stand on a bank and watch someone drown for want of a decision made quickly enough. He remembered, diving in, how he had once stood helpless beside his wife's bed, while her breathing slowed and there had been nothing left for his hands to do but hold hers, and how that helplessness had settled into him afterward like a stone he carried everywhere, and how the one mercy of this river, this morning, this stranger, was that here at least there was still a current a man could fight, still a body he might reach in time, still something his own 2 arms could do besides simply watch. He had not expected, hauling her out, to find a settler woman, dressed plain and half frozen in a wool dress gone heavy with river water, marked about the wrists with rope burns that told him everything he needed to know about how she had come to be in that water in the first place. His men had wanted, at first, to leave her at the edge of Concord Crossing's own land and ride on, reasoning that whatever quarrel the settlers had with one of their own was no business of his band's to inherit. And there was sense in that caution. The soldiers at the fort 2 days' ride south had grown less patient every season with any story of his people and settler women crossing paths, however innocent the truth of it. And he understood plainly what a settler mob would say if they learned a Lakota chief had carried one of their women into his own camp, whatever the truth of her rescue. But he had looked at the rope burns on her wrists and the exhaustion in her face, and found he could not simply leave a half-drowned woman on a riverbank to be found by the same men who had thrown her in. And so he had wrapped her in his own robe and brought her home, and told himself he would decide what came next once she was warm and breathing steady, which was, he privately admitted, no plan at all, only the plain refusal to let cruelty finish what it had started. The camp received her with a wariness Eliza understood without needing the language to translate it. Children hushed and stared. An old woman the others called grandmother examined her with the frank assessing eyes of someone who had tended a great many strangers and trusted very few of them. And one man in particular, an elder named White Elk whose opinion Tatanka Ska plainly weighed with care, made no effort to hide his disapproval. She watched them speak in low, urgent tones by the fire that first night, understanding nothing of the words but everything of the argument, because an argument about whether to keep a stranger looked the same in any tongue. "She is a settler," White Elk said, not unkindly but not gently either, once the children had been sent off to their evening meal. "The soldiers already look for reasons to call us a danger to their people. If this woman is found among us, whatever the truth of how she came here, they will say we stole her, or worse, and it will not matter that your own hands pulled her from the water rather than pushed her into it. You know this as well as I do." "I know it," Tatanka Ska said. "I also know that if I had left her on that bank, she would be dead by morning, and I would have to live the rest of my life having chosen my own comfort over a woman's life, because her people are foolish and cruel. I have made worse bargains than the risk of keeping her a few days until she is strong enough to decide her own path. I will not apologize for that, White Elk, whatever the soldiers choose to believe of us. They have believed the worst of us regardless, every season, whether we deserve it or not." White Elk said nothing further that night, though the set of his shoulders made plain he had not been persuaded so much as outvoted by a man whose judgment he had trusted for 20 years, and did not intend to abandon now over a single disagreement. Eliza slept that first night in a corner of the chief's own lodge, given over to her by a woman she later learned was his sister, wrapped in furs warmer than anything Concord Crossing had ever offered her, and woke at dawn to the sound of a child laughing somewhere outside. A small, ordinary sound that struck her, after the week she had lived through, as almost unbearably strange, proof that the world went on being gentle in places even while it was busy trying to kill her in others. The days that followed were strange in the way that any life rebuilt from ruin is strange. Full of small kindnesses she did not yet have words to properly thank anyone for. Tatanka Ska's sister taught her, patiently and with a good deal of laughter at Eliza's clumsiness, how to work a hide the way the camp's women did, and though Eliza never grew skilled at it, the hours spent trying earned her something better than skill. A place, however small, among women who had at first only tolerated her presence out of respect for their chief's decision. Children who had hushed and stared that first night grew bold enough within a week to bring her small offerings, a smooth river stone, a handful of late berries, testing whether the strange pale woman with the healer's careful hands might be worth keeping after all. Eliza found herself, more than once in those early days, blinking back tears at gestures far smaller than anything Concord Crossing had ever offered her in 3 full years of tending its sick, and understood slowly that she had stumbled, half-drowned and hopeless, into the first real community she had known since her mother died. She learned, over the days that followed, that fever had come to the camp as well that season, striking hardest among the youngest children, and that the same helplessness she had felt in Concord Crossing watching the Bragg boy fail to improve was being felt here too, in a lodge not 50 yards from where she slept, where Tatanka Ska's own small daughter, a girl of perhaps 5 whom everyone called Little Bird, lay listless and burning under the same grandmother's increasingly worried care. Eliza recognized the fever's particular pattern the moment she was allowed near enough to see it. The same flush, the same rattling breath, the same slow slide toward the kind of stillness that frightened healers more than any amount of noise or crying. And she understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than it frightened her, that she knew exactly what this illness wanted and exactly what fought it best, because she had spent a lifetime learning precisely that. However little good it had done her, in Concord Crossing's eyes. "Let me help her," she said to Tatanka Ska, the first full sentence she had offered him unprompted since the riverbank. "I know this fever. I've fought it before. I can't promise I'll win, no one can promise that, but I know what eases it and what makes it worse, and I would rather try than watch." He studied her a long moment, a settler woman still marked with rope burns from a town that had called her a poisoner for failing to save one child, now offering to risk that same failure again on his own daughter, knowing full well what it might cost her a second time if this fever, too, proved stronger than her skill. "Why would you offer that?" he asked, "after what your own people did to you for trying?" "Because I'd rather be the woman who tried and failed than the woman who could have tried and didn't," Eliza said. "I've had a week now to decide what kind of person I mean to be regardless of what anyone else believes of me, and I've decided. I'd like the chance to prove it means something." He gave her that chance, over grandmother's initial wariness and White Elk's outright objection, because something in the plainness of her offer matched something he recognized in himself. And for 3 days and nights, Eliza worked over Little Bird the way she had worked over half of Concord Crossing, cooling the fever with wet cloths and willow bark tea, holding the small hot body upright to ease her breathing through the worst of the coughing, refusing to sleep more than an hour at a stretch until the crisis broke. And on the 4th morning it did break, the fever loosening its grip all at once the way fevers sometimes mercifully did, and Little Bird opened clear eyes and asked, in her own tongue, for water. And Eliza wept again, differently this time, with relief instead of grief, and found Tatanka Ska's hand closing warm and steady around her shoulder in a gesture that needed no translation at all. Word of what she had done moved through the camp faster than the fever itself had, and White Elk himself came to her by the fire that evening, stiff with the particular discomfort of a proud man admitting error, and told her that he had judged her by her people rather than by herself, and that he would not make that mistake again. It was not an apology exactly, in the way Concord Crossing understood apologies, but Eliza had lived long enough among people who mistook cruelty for judgment to recognize honest respect when it was finally offered her, and she accepted it as the gift it was. She and Tatanka Ska found themselves, in the weeks that followed, walking the river bend together in the evenings more often than either of them had cause to explain to anyone, including themselves. He showed her, one such evening, the fish weir his people had tended for 3 generations, explaining with evident pride how his grandfather had built it, and his father had rebuilt it after a spring flood. And Eliza found herself asking question after question, delighted in a way she had not expected by how much thought and care had gone into something she would once have looked at, from a settler's ignorant distance, as nothing more than sticks in a river. In turn, she taught him the names of the plants she used in her tinctures, surprised and then quietly moved to discover that grandmother already knew most of them by different names, and used half of them for the very same purposes, so that the 2 healing traditions turned out, once compared honestly, to be far closer cousins than either woman had first assumed. He told her, slowly, over several such evenings, of his wife, of the fever that had taken her, of the 5 years he had spent since telling himself a chief with a people to protect had no business wanting anything so soft as a second chance at loving someone, when loving someone had already cost him so much grief once before. I told myself I kept my heart closed for my people's sake, he admitted one evening, watching the river run gray under a darkening sky. But I have come to think, since the night I pulled you from this water, that I kept it closed mostly for my own. It is easier to guard a wound than to let it heal crooked and trust it anyway. She told him of her own mother, who had taught her healing and died before she could see her daughter cast into a river for practicing it, of a life spent believing herself useful only so long as she succeeded, never once loved simply for being present. I built my whole worth in Concord Crossing on what my hands could do for people, she said. I never once let myself imagine being wanted for anything less useful than that. It is a strange thing being here, being wanted just for sitting beside a fire and saying nothing at all. You are not less useful here, he said. You are simply no longer only useful. There is a difference, and I think you deserve to feel it. Neither of them named what was growing between them for a long while after that, because both had learned, in their separate ways, to be wary of hoping for things the world seemed determined to take back. But the walks grew longer regardless, and the silences between them grew easier, and Little Bird took to trailing after them both with the unembarrassed confidence of a child who has already decided, long before the adults around her, exactly how a story ought to end. It was White Elk, of all people, who finally said it aloud, watching them return from the river one evening with the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped noticing the space between them. You look at her the way you looked at no one since your wife walked this earth, he told Tatanka Ska, not as accusation now, but as simple observation. I was wrong to fear her. I am not wrong to see that. Whatever comes of it, do not waste it out of the same caution I once tried to press on you. What came before the first snow was trouble from the direction both of them had half expected. Nathaniel Bragg, having learned somehow likely through a trapper who traded with both camp and town, that the woman he had condemned to the river was alive and sheltered among the very people Concord Crossing had always been taught to fear, rode out with 6 armed men, and the fevered conviction of someone who had never once considered that his own judgment might have been the thing wanting correction. He found the camp at midday and demanded, loud enough for the whole river bend to hear, that the poisoner be returned to face what the river had failed to finish. Tatanka Ska met him at the camp's edge alone, unarmed, but for the knife every man carried for ordinary use. His own men gathered behind him in a line that made plain, without a single weapon raised, that Bragg's 6 riders would not simply walk through them. "She poisoned no one," he said, in English clear enough that no man present could claim to have misunderstood him. "I have watched her spend 3 days and nights fighting the same fever that took your own son, this time for my daughter, asking nothing for it but the chance to try. A woman who poisons children does not sit awake 3 nights running to save one who is not even her own. You buried your son to an illness no healer living could have stopped, Nathaniel Bragg, and you have spent the season since looking for someone to carry a grief that belongs to no one but the fever itself. It happened, by fortune neither of them had arranged, that a doctor from the fort 2 days south had ridden through the camp only the week before, trading news and medicine both ways as the post surgeon sometimes did with bands at peace along his route, and had examined the water at Concord Crossing's upstream spring on Tatanka Ska's own request, curious whether the fever's pattern matched a poisoning or something plainer, and had found the spring fouled by a dead animal lodged upstream in the rocks. The true and ordinary cause of a fever that superstition alone had turned into witchcraft. Tatanka Ska produced the doctor's own written note now, carried carefully these past days precisely in case a moment like this one arrived, and held it out to Bragg's men rather than to Bragg himself, trusting the ordinary riders behind him to read plain sense where their leader's grief had long since stopped allowing it. "Your own fort's doctor found the cause a week past," Tatanka Ska said. "Fouled water, nothing more, nothing a healer's hands could have prevented once it began. You may ride back and tell your town that, or you may ride back and keep believing what comforts you more than the truth does. But you will not take this woman from my land today, or any day after it, and you will not raise a hand to do it while I am standing here to answer for her." Bragg's face, hearing this, went through something like a physical struggle, grief and fury, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had built his whole remaining pride on being right about something. And for a moment Eliza feared he would simply order his men forward regardless of the truth laid out plain before him, law or no law, doctor's note or no doctor's note. "That paper proves nothing," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Doctors are wrong. I know what I buried. I know whose hands were the last ones on my son before the fever took him for good, and I mean to have an answer for it, whatever a fort surgeon 2 days south wants to claim he found in a spring." "You want someone to answer for your grief," Tatanka Ska said, "because grief with no one to answer for it is the hardest kind any man carries. I have carried that kind myself, Nathaniel Bragg, for 5 winters now, and I will tell you plainly that blaming an innocent woman never once made mine lighter. It only gave me somewhere false to set it down, so that I never had to carry it the honest way, which is the only way it ever truly heals." It was one of Bragg's own men, a quiet farmer named Otto Weiss, who had lost no one to the fever, and had ridden along more from fear of refusing than any real conviction, who finally lowered his rifle and said, plain and tired, that he for one had had enough of burying children and burying blame both, and would rather ride home than be part of dragging a woman back to a river that had already tried once to kill her over a grief she'd had no hand in causing. One by one, the others followed his lead, until Bragg sat alone on his horse in front of a line of men who no longer stood behind him, his fury with nowhere left to spend itself. And he wheeled his horse at last, and rode back toward Concord Crossing with nothing to show for the ride, but the particular loneliness of a man who has run out of people willing to share his anger. Eliza, who had watched the whole exchange from behind the line of Tatanka Ska's men, with her heart beating so hard she thought it might be heard across the clearing, found him turning to her once the dust of Bragg's retreat had settled, and understood, in the steadiness of his gaze, that whatever answer she gave next would decide considerably more than one afternoon. "You could still go back," he said. "Not to that man, not to what he tried to do to you, but somewhere of your own people's choosing, if that's what you want. I would not stop you, and I would not think less of you for wanting a life among your own kind after everything this land has cost you." "I have thought about that," Eliza said, "every night since the river, if I'm honest with you the way you've always been with me. And I find the only place I want to go is wherever you and little Bird already are. I did not come to this camp looking for a home, Tatanka Ska. I came half drowned and half dead, and expecting nothing at all. But I have found more honesty here in a few short weeks than Concord Crossing offered me in a lifetime. And I would rather build whatever comes next on that honesty than on the comfort of going back to people who tried to kill me for failing to be more than human." He crossed the distance between them then, slow, giving her every chance to step back if she meant to, and did not close his hand around hers until she had closed hers first around his. And the camp around them, watching without pretending not to, understood before either of them said another word that the settler woman the river had tried to take had chosen, of her own free will, and against every fear either side had been raised to carry, to stay. They were bound together before the first hard snow, in a ceremony Eliza understood only in its broad shape, but felt entirely in its meaning. Grandmother singing something low and old beside her. White Elk standing witness with the particular solemnity of a man honoring the correction of his own misjudgment. And little Bird, fully recovered and fierce with the unembarrassed joy, only a child that age could manage, declaring to anyone who would listen that Eliza was hers now, and always had been, since the very night the fever broke. Eliza wore, for the ceremony, a dress the camp's women had helped her make over the preceding weeks, part settler cut and part their own careful beadwork, a small blended thing that pleased her more than any gown Concord Crossing could have offered, precisely because no one had asked her to choose only one half of herself over the other. Tatanka Ska stood before her in the fading autumn light with his people gathered close around them both, and when at last he took her hand before them all, he said, quiet enough that it belonged to her alone even in so public a moment, that he had pulled a stranger from a river, not knowing he was pulling out the second half of his own life along with her, and that he meant to spend whatever winters remained to him, proving the river had chosen more wisely that morning than any town downstream ever had. Concord Crossing in time heard the whole truth of the fouled spring and the doctor's note, carried back by Otto Weiss and the other men who had turned their horses around that day. And Nathaniel Bragg found himself a smaller and lonelier man in his own town for the telling of it, shunned by neighbors who had finally had their fill of a grief that had cost an innocent woman nearly her life. Eliza, when word of his diminishment reached her eventually by way of the same trading trapper who had once carried news the other direction, found she felt no triumph in it at all, only a quiet gratitude that she no longer lived anywhere near enough to feel the weight of his grief as her own, and a private hope, which she never quite managed to set aside, that some year the fever's true and ordinary cause would soften even his heart enough to let him grieve his son honestly at last, without needing anyone else to carry the blame for him. She built her life instead along a river that had once tried to drown her, and had instead delivered her, exactly, to where she was always meant to be, healing whoever needed healing on whichever side of the water asked for it, settler travelers and camp children alike, with little Bird trailing at her heels most days learning the names of every root and leaf her new mother gathered. And Tatanka Ska, watching her some evenings still walk the same bend where he had first pulled her gasping from the current, would think that the river, for all the cruelty it had nearly done that gray morning, had in the end shown considerably better judgment than the town that fed her to it, delivering into his hands, without either of them asking for it, exactly the second chance both their grieving hearts had long since stopped believing they deserved.